G'day guys, today I'm going to be talking about the Russian Revolution and in particular the consolidation of power after the 1917 October Revolution. So this is obviously part of the Russian Revolution from History Revolutions, the VCE subject. It's part of Unit 3, so terms 1 and 2 of Year 12, and in particular the second area of study, which focuses on the aftermath of the October Revolution and the taking of power by the Bolsheviks and Vladimir Lenin. So today what we're going to look at is we're going to get a high-level understanding of the challenges faced by Lenin and his mates in consolidating power after the revolution. This will include the dissolution of the Constituent Assembly, the political opposition he faced, the creation of the Sovnarkom, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and the positive changes under the new regime. Now, revolutions in the real world, at any point in time, part of the world, a country or an area is undergoing a historic upheaval that often echoes the characteristics of the original revolutions. So France, Russia, China, and America. I mean, if you want to look right now at Hong Kong or Venezuela or the war in South Sudan, you'll see not all but parts of the old revolutions, and through that you can understand why we learn about them, because history is a living thing and it often repeats, and we can learn from and predict using history. So you'll find this particular area, the consolidation of power, in section B of the exam. So both the source analysis, and I believe it's now 2 or 3 sources you have to analyse, and the essay incorporate the consolidation of power after 1917. So Lenin took power in a bloody revolution in October 1917. It's often called the Battle of Moscow, which ended with 7,000 casualties. So the city was in absolute disarray. And this can in part explain how Lenin took such iron-fisted power with very little resistance. So there was a democratic constituent assembly that had been set up in the February Revolution, headed by Alexander Kerensky. Lenin did not trust Kerensky, nor did he trust the Constituent Assembly. Famously, he said, "There can be no government but a Soviet government." And to this end, he dismissed the assembly, but when he attempted to arrest Kerensky, he had fled. Now, initially, the Congress of Soviets was supposed to oversee laws, which was a Congress of Unions, but Lenin, in fact, brought power into a new institution called the Sovnarkom. This consisted of 15 incredibly powerful Bolsheviks that were loyal to Lenin and to the party. He dismissed talks between the Mensheviks, who were more right-wing socialists, and other socialist parties, that they would be part of the government. This has often been used to criticise Lenin and say that he really only cared for the Bolsheviks and not for a sort of democratic societal change. So Lenin, having come to power, promised the people 3 things: peace, bread, and land. Now, land he achieved by the abolition of all private property. He stated that it belonged to the people, and so what he did was essentially said, the country of Russia, the state of Russia, owns all the land, and we will distribute it as we see fit. And so that was in order to ensure that every peasant and every homeless person had land, and rich people weren't able to own massive amounts of land and sort of lock people out of having a house. He also said bread, and bread just meant no one would go hungry. He would feed every man, woman, and child in Russia at the time. Now, this promise was made in part due to the negative effects of the First World War, which brings us to peace. Now, peace was achieved through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the First World War, was having an incredibly negative effect on Russia, and Lenin and his right-hand man Leon Trotsky decided peace must be orchestrated so that Russia could move on with this socialist revolution instead of continuing to fight the Germans in what he called an imperialist war. So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, as Donald Trump there might indicate, was not a super deal for Russia. It was agreed to on March 3rd, 1918, and took Russia out of the First World War. The war had taken a brutal toll on the country. It had lost 38 billion rubles. Goods prices had inflated by 500% since the war. And in the first 2 years alone, Russia lost 4 million men. So the war was incredibly unpopular. And even though the treaty was a poor deal, getting out of the war itself was quite popular. What happened was Trotsky, Lenin's right-hand man, orchestrated a ceasefire on 15th of December 1917 and initiated talks. Trotsky began to stall for about 3 or 4 months because he was hoping Germans back in Germany, back in Berlin, would see the revolution in Moscow and take up arms as well. Unfortunately, this did not happen, and so he eventually agreed to a deal that involved a loss of 3 billion rubles, 1/3 of European Russia, so that's European Russia is west of the Caucasus Mountains, the majority of their grain and fuel sites, and they were forced to disarm the Russian military. Now, when the Bolsheviks took power, there was much unrest, much street violence and gang violence all over Russia. The country was in total disarray. And initially, the Bolsheviks believed this was just the working class rising up and finishing the revolution that had begun in Moscow. However, the violence continued, and so in the end, Lenin and the Sovnarkom were forced to create the Cheka, which was one of the world's first secret police organizations. The Cheka was headed by a man named Felix Dzerzhinsky. Remember how to spell that for the exam? That's him on the right. They called him Iron Felix. And essentially what the Cheka did was find and destroy, often, counter-revolutionaries, spies, and agitators. Now, as you can imagine, spies and agitators were, in the disarray of post-revolution Russia, just anyone the Bolsheviks didn't like. Now, although this all seems quite grim, with the Cheka, the treaty, and the violence all over Russia, there were some positive changes to Russian society. The abolition of private property brought about an effective end to homelessness on December 6, 1917. Women were granted full equality to divorce their male counterpart only 12 days later. Full and universal kinder and creche were implemented, which was very popular. And the Russians changed to the Gregorian calendar in line with the rest of Europe. And lastly, they separated church from state. So the Russian Orthodox Church had quite an influence over the Tsar and the government that preceded Lenin. And you can see on the right one of the classic images you often get in an exam. So as you can see on the left in the background is a church, and it's sort of old and rickety and falling apart. and I think there's ravens coming out the back, so you can sort of see that. And there's a crusty old man, ringing the bell, and so you sort of see that the church is old and decrepit, and the crone that's grabbing the young Russian girl, all dressed in black and pointing with a kind of nobbled finger towards the older institution, whereas the young Russian girl dressed in bright red and white, so the Soviet colours, is sort of putting her hand and looking towards, that says school in Russian. So there's a fella playing a horn in a kind of trumpeting way, if you'll pardon the pun, and there's a biplane above that, and it's kind of representing sort of technology in progress. So that's a classic exam source analysis image, and I've given you a quick source analysis there, but we will do a much more focused source analysis video later. So that's everything I've got to say about the initial consolidation of power after the October Revolution. Final tips, try and remember as many dates as you can. My teacher always used to say the examiners love to sort of glance at a paper and see the dates jump out at them. I would also say I used to treat history as a story, and you'll enjoy it much more if you sort of you engage with the characters of Lenin and Kerensky and Dzerzhinsky and eventually Stalin when he turns up. And my final tip is, kids, don't try communism at home, or do. I'm not your boss.